Hey friends, Chris Maholka here. This video is going to be about the epoxy that you use when you're building fishing rods, in particular to cover up things like decorative thread wraps or the wraps that are around your guides, that hold your guides on. Now over the years I found out there are some good epoxies and some bad epoxies, and today I think I'm going to test out three of what I consider the best. I'm going to compare them for several things. These are the three epoxies we're going to test today. One is Flex Coat's High Build Formula rod wrapping finish. The next is Voodoo Rod's Diamond D2 coat finish. And the third is Classic Rod Coat's Super Rod Coat finish. I'm trying to keep this as even and fair as possible. We're going to make sure we measure very carefully, and we're going to use syringes to measure Part A and Part B out, and I've got a set of syringes for each one of the epoxies so we don't mix or cross-contaminate anything. Once we put that out from the syringes onto our mixing plastic, I'm going to use the back of my paintbrush that I'll apply it with and just mix it so I can see on the plastic when it's really mixed well. After we got it mixed, there's a couple tests we're going to do. First off, I have wrapped this white painted rod blank, my test rod blank, with three different colors of thread. I've got a gray, a yellow, and a tan. And I kept them light because a lot of the problem you have with epoxies is darkening down your thread if you don't use a thread sealer, a color preserver on it. And some people don't like to use it. So I'm going to do this test without color preserver. I'm going to coat each series in a different epoxy, and then I'm going to let it dry down and see not only how it affects the threads, but also I can use the white blank to compare if the epoxy appears slightly darkened or not once it dries. After we do that, we're going to take the remainder of it, we're going to put it in our film canister cap and fill it up to the top, and we're going to see then when we're done with the curing process how it is for clarity. And we're going to do it in a large container and also two small little rubber bands I've got set out here. And if you want more detail on how this is done, I refer to my 5-minute epoxy video for that. But we're going to test it for clarity, how long it takes to set up, color darkening, and then gloss finish after it's cured. We're ready to start our first mix, and we're going to go with the Classic Rod Coat. And when I use syringes, I always like to color coordinate them, basically. The Part A in this case is light, so I'll go with the yellow with my lighter color cap, and I'll use my black with the black. If I do that, it keeps me from cross-contaminating, mixing syringes up and getting one into the other, which could cause a lot of problems with your epoxy. It could cause the whole bottle to set up. So we're going to start out with our Part A. We're going to just go down to the tip of the syringe in the epoxy. We don't want to bury the whole front end. And we're going to draw up 3 cc's of epoxy. Try that again without getting air bubbles in it. There we go. There's our 3 cc's of Part A. And then we're going to do our 3 cc's of Part B. Cover things up so we don't spill them or drop things. And on this, the Part B is a little thinner than the Part A, so it draws up quite a bit easier into the syringe. And there's a reason I don't squirt A out and then draw the B, is you don't want it to spread too much before you get the other part in and create mixing problems. So we'll shoot our 2 parts out on the plastic. It doesn't hurt to leave them sit like this and just kind of acclimatize a little bit before you start mixing them. So here we go. I'm going to hold the plastic and mix really well, going back and forth, so I'm sure I'm getting all this extra from the outsides back into the middle. And I don't want to create too many bubbles, so I don't want to really stir it hard. And we're going to do this for about 2 minutes. or in, well, 2 minutes We want the epoxy to be nice and clear. You don't want to see any striations in it where the A and B are mixing. You want it to be mixed really well. So 2 minutes is a good rule of thumb, and if you read the packaging on some of these, it actually tells you how long you should mix. And stay up with those instructions because they have them written that way for a reason. I'll get my rod set up in the rotator, and this is a little Flex Coat 6 RPM model. I've got a little rubber foam plug I cut that I put over the end of the rod to protect it and insert it in the rotator, and then I'm going to start the rotator. To make things a little easier, I always square off the ends of the brush by cutting it with a pair of scissors to get a flat edge, because when I lay that up on top and start coating with epoxy, I don't want to have any long extra hair spreading out to spread the epoxy places I don't want it. So I've got my epoxy ready, my brush ready, here we go. Apply a nice smooth coat all the way around the thread. And again, I want to make sure this gets out to just over the outside edges so we can judge clarity of the epoxy after it cures. Just go hold my brush there and let it rotate around underneath it. Nice even coat. And back to the other side and do the same. Just hold it and let the rod rotate underneath the brush. A nice even bead all the way around. And again, I'm overlapping some, probably more than I normally would, outside the thread wraps, just so we can judge the clarity on the white rod blank. I'm just going to fill in the middle, and if you're doing a lot of these, you know you don't have to be real nice and tidy the first on the coat of epoxy, because you're going to clear the bubbles out with a torch of some variety or heat of some variety, which will help also smooth out the coat, round the coat out. So let's fill the rest of that in. Let that rotate for a moment. Make sure it's all coated all the way around. To clear bubbles, I'm going to use my alcohol torch. Light that. Make sure I got a nice good flame going out of that there with a couple squeezes, not spitting any alcohol out. Get those bubbles out. You can see how nicely the bubbles pop and clear out in that little bit of torch. And it also makes it thin out just a little bit. The heat thins the epoxy, and you see it's going to drip. And that's fine, because that's more epoxy that I put on than I really needed, but I wanted to make sure I covered everything well. And if you're doing this on a guide, you take the brush, and when it gets to have a drop underneath, you remove the drop like that. And that looks pretty close. Thinned it out just a little bit too much in the middle. Add a little bit back in there for the purpose of our testing. Now I'll use the rest of my epoxy and add it to my little test dishes here to make sure that this way I can see once the epoxy sets up, I can pop the sample out of this lid and see how clear it is overall. Also, I'm going to put a few drops in these little rubber bands. This makes it a little bit thinner test area. The rubber bands form a little dam that will hold the epoxy in and give me a smaller sample, which is more accurate to the rod blank than the big one is. But the big one gives us an amplified view of how well we've cured up and how it's going to look when it's in really thick coats, if you have to do a couple of coats over a rod. Say for heavy duty offshore type fishing. So now the only thing left to do is repeat this process with the other two epoxies on the other two thread wraps. I'm going to let this cure overnight, basically 12 hours, and I will get back on the video after it's cured up and let you see the results. Okay, we're back after letting these rotate for 12 hours. We've marked the rod with each epoxy, the S for the super coat, the V for the voodoo rod, and the F for flex coat, so we'll know which ones are which. I also marked on our little tests with the epoxy and the rubber bands, and in the lid I marked the names on all three of those so we can compare them for clarity, and there's definitely some things we've learned, so let's talk about these. So my first reaction on all these is that all three are nice and clear. We didn't get a darkening of the thread wraps, even with using light thread. Didn't change our colors much. The first one is the super coat. It's nice and clear. It finished nice and glossy and isn't tacky at all. This is our voodoo. It's also very clear, no tack, looks very nice. And our flex coat, again, very clear, very smooth, and no issues with color changing. We'll go back to the super coat. One thing I did notice on these in particular is the thickness of the coating. The super coat appears to be a little thicker, even though I heated it and used the same criteria for knocking off the excess with heat and getting the last of the extra removed. The D2 rod finish, which is listed kind of just as a standard rod finish, is nice and even and smooth, covered nicely on all areas. Now the flex coat, which is the formula I used was the high build, isn't really much thicker. It's very, very slightly thicker than the voodoo and really, really close on the super coats. Now, or the classic coat. So now one thing I did notice is I let these actually turn for 4 hours with the slow 6 RPM rotation. After 4 hours, I shut the rotation off and let them just sit, because it says on all these that after you can rotate them by hand for like 2 hours, you can let them rest and cure. One thing I noticed, you can see it right here, is the classic coats. You can see the little lump there where it goes up. It drooped after 4 hours. It actually sagged down to the bottom from not rotating. So if you're not doing automatic rotating, if you're not doing electric rotating, if you're doing it by hand, you probably want to stay away from the classic rod coat, because it is going to take at least 4 hours to cure up well. And again, I did these tests at 70 degrees. Warmer temperatures, it may cure better. None of the others drooped at all. They sat really well after the 4 hours of rotation. So let's look at our little test blanks and see how those look. So this is our sample that we did on camera of our classic coat rod finish. And all I'm going to do is take the lid and just pop that epoxy out of there. So we have that sample. And then with our little green rubber bands, we can do the same thing. We can just pull the rubber band off, and it gives us a nice little clear sample piece that almost disappears there against the white background. So what we can look at now is how much clarity we got on that epoxy. This is again the classic coat. Nice and clear. Doesn't have a lot of color in it. You can see even from the edge, looking through all that epoxy, that it's very, very clear. The one thing I did find on this is that in the instructions it says use in the well ventilated area, because the part B of this smells really bad and really strong. If you don't have a ventilator, I wouldn't mix this in your house or in your shop. I doubt anybody's doing their rod coating outdoors, but that's almost what's called for in this. because the smell after I mixed this was on my clothes and on my, my hands, and it was all through my shop too, and it made it smell really, really bad. So if you are using this, make sure you're in a super well ventilated area and someplace that the smell, if it hangs around for a couple days, isn't going to disrupt your family. The next is the Voodoo rod coat. The Voodoo, again, very clear. The one issue I did have with this is that it was really hard to get the bubbles out of it. On the rod, using the heat, it still held a lot of tiny, tiny bubbles. I don't know how well those can even be seen, but there are still little pinhole bubbles in here. So you have to make sure, if you're using the Voodoo, that it clears all the way on your rod, that you use enough heat to get it to get rid of all those little bubbles. Of course, the clear pieces, or the small pieces in the rubber band, show the clarity really well. So if you take care and use something to remove bubbles, this is an excellent, excellent coating for rods. Next and last is our Flex Coat. Flex Coat doesn't have any odor, neither does the Voodoo. It appeared to clear really well. Again, I didn't use any heat or anything on these samples, I just let them sit. But on the rod, it cleared very well. No bubbles in the finished rod at all. Now with the Flex Coat, you can see, if you look at it end on, there is just a tiny bit of yellow color, but that's looking through an inch of epoxy, something you're never going to run into on a rod. Our small samples, basically clear, no color issues on those, and that's how a thick rod coat would look. So that gives you an indication that the Flex Coat is going to perform really well for you. Thanks for staying with me on this. I've got some opinions on these, and I'm going to share those with you now. And again, these are just opinions. The Super Rod Coat did a good job as far as coating without bubbles. Seemed to do fine. The smell, quite honestly, is overwhelming. Will I ever open these bottles again? I don't think so. The Voodoo Rod Coat, for a lighter, seemed to be a little bit lighter coat, is really good stuff. You have to be very careful with it, clear your bubbles, and you might watch my video on how to mix epoxy without bubbles. I go through some of the pre-coating steps on how to keep bubbles out of your epoxy. For a light to medium coat, I think this is excellent stuff. It's very clear, has a great looking finish on it. I would recommend the Voodoo without a doubt. Now, the Flex Coat, you'll notice I use some Flex Coat equipment, but I'm not affiliated with them or any company in any way. I'm just a guy that builds a lot of tackle. The Flex Coat's been around for a long time. I've used it for years and years. The formula has always seemed to be really good. It hasn't changed. It is good for clearing bubbles out. It clears very easily, mixes easily, cures up pretty quick. To your 2-hour window, it will clear in that amount of time. And this has always been kind of the standard by which other epoxies were compared, and I think it still is. The Voodoo is really good. The Flex Coat's really good. The high build formula did perform a little bit better on the thickness coating on the rod windings, so if you're looking for medium, really clear, nice working, the Voodoo, heavier, really nice working, the Flex Coat. So there you go. That's what I found. Now I just got to figure out a way to clear the smell out of my studio and move on with my next project. Thanks for watching.